Hello, everyone. I welcome you to this round of the FUBiS digital lecture series. My name is Markus Funck, and I will be with you today for the next 45 minutes or so. I am a trained historian who was educated in Germany and Canada. Did my PhD actually here in Berlin in the early 2000s with a thesis on the Prussian military nobility, went back to Canada for a DAD professorship in history at York University, and returned to Berlin, where I'm now based at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at another um, institution of higher education here in the city of Berlin. My research interests include, well, besides anti-Semitism and related topics, the history of German elites in the 19th and 20th century, but also the history of our social political language and the concepts that are connected to that, in particularly the question of the relationship between sameness and difference. Well, I have always loved to teach in international environments, and my time in Canada in particular has taught me that this is the, well, most fruitful way to gain new insights from very different perspectives from people with very different backgrounds. And this diversity, this is what I've learned throughout my career, is sometimes a bit difficult, but in most cases, has to be considered as a strength. And this is why I like the FUBiS program so much and joined it actually last year, because there you, well, get together with young people from very different parts of this world with very different experiences, but, well, with the common goal, and this is gaining more insight, more knowledge about a variety of topics. Of course, this lecture here, representing the course I'm teaching at FUBiS, is not the only one in the program. And the organizers of the Freie University Berlin International Summer School have reorganized their websites and created a fantastic film that gives you an introduction into the program and other available courses um, here in Berlin. Normally they are taught in classrooms. Well, we are real people. But in these days, and as we all know, we do not know how long they will last. We decided to move online to keep in touch with you. And if you're interested, let's get in touch with us. The course I'm teaching is entitled Seduction and Terror, Hitler's Germany. It is offered, as I said, normally on site, or as we do it these days, online. It's credited with 4 ECTS points. It's running for 3 weeks in the summer, 2 days a week for 3 units. The content of this course is actually very broad. We explore all possible aspects, the history of National Socialism. Um, for example, the political history, so questions like how did the Nazis actually came to power, how did they establish the power system in Germany, then moving to foreign politics, how did they, well, reinvent Germany in international settings and actually prepared for war in the later 1930s 30s. But also a very important aspect of this course is related to society and culture in general. So we do not look at Germany and the German population as a monolithic, homogeneous unit, but as a modern society that was differentiated and different groups, of course, were related in different ways to National Socialism, played different roles in National Socialism, and were differently affected by National Socialist rules. Just to give you some example, women who during the Weimar Republic, so the German democratic state that was created after World War I, during the Weimar Republic, women gained some more well, maneuvering space for emancipating, so getting into the workforce, and actually getting the right to vote in general, and so on. So the image and the reality of modern women emerged during the Weimar Republic. And as you might know, the National Socialists had very strong ideological ideas about women and their role in society. And so this is one aspect of this course that we'll look at actually how women fared in Nazi Germany. Were they complicit? Were they kind of restricted to the household and so on? Well, and we look at very different sections of society, not only women, but also other groups like workers, like certainly minorities, elites, and so on. This is kind of the first part, or a little bit more than the first half of this course. The second half of this course is dealing with I would say, the second half of National Socialist rule, which is shaped by aggressive foreign policy, by aggressive persecution of, well, members of its own population, most commonly known, the Jewish minority in Germany, and then even radicalizing towards World War II, a truly global war that was accompanied by horrific war crimes and murders, not at the least the murder of the European Jews, also called the Holocaust. So we will look at the course of this war on different fronts, but also the war the Nazis in Germany actually fought against populations, not only against countries and military of those countries, but against the people of those countries. And finally, we will look at what actually the historical meaning of all this, of National Socialism, is in modern Germany. So what is the kind of how were memory politics disputed and shaped in the two Germanys after 1945 and then in unified Germany after 1989? And well, what place does the memory on National Socialism and on the murder of the European Jews have in our modern society? The learning objectives, well, first of all, I would like to teach you facts. Some facts you might actually do not know yet about National Socialism, so we will go into some very details as well, aspects that are normally not taught in kind of overview classes. But also, I hope that we all get a better understanding, particularly in the light of current events all over the globe, that we'll get a better understanding of how Germany, as a, well, a fragile but still a democratic state after 1918, turned from democracy to a radically new form of dictatorship, Nazism. Secondly, and this is what I will predominantly talk about today, it will be crucial to understand how the Nazis established and secured power in the early days of their dictatorship. Only within 2 years, the whole system of terror, persecution, etc., was established. So it's crucial to understand those rapid steps that were taken at the very beginning. And then finally, how an entire population, so the German population or German society at large, prepared for this global war and the attempted extermination of the European Jews. Because, I mean, this is nothing specific to Germany. For modern war in the mid 20th century, all of the population had to be mobilized, and this definitely has dramatic impacts on these populations themselves. So we will look at those impacts, but also what made Germans actually support the ideological and political goals of National Socialism. So I was asked to, well, give you some information about the, well, place of the city of Berlin in this course, as we all hope that you will come to Berlin as soon as possible and taking our courses. Well, I can't say less, but Berlin is, well, the site of what's happening in many respects. First of all, what's happening in our course. We will meet in classrooms, it has to be, but we will also go on excursions. And you might have heard of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, well, the famous one right next to the Brandenburg Gate. And you might have heard of the German Historical Museum, but Berlin is actually the site of numerous memorial sites, museums, and the like related, not only, but in many respects related to National Socialism. So what I'm actually doing in my excursions is that I'm asking students for their particular interests, because we can satisfy all of them here in the city of Berlin. I just gave you some examples of places I really like to go, not because the topics they deal with are so amazing, but because the way they deal with the way they present history is very convincing and indeed amazing. So there is one place called the Topography of Terror Documentation Center at the site of the former headquarters of the SS, the so-called Reichssicherheitshauptamt, and the Gestapo. So those, well, police and police-like forces that were responsible for the planning and execution for the murder of European Jews, but also of other groups, including resistance fighters, including opposition movements outside of Germany in occupied territories, and including terror against the own population. A second place I like to go to is the house of the Wannsee Conference. And here I have to go a little bit into a descriptive form. You have to know the Wannsee is a beautiful lake located in the, well, quite affluent southwestern district of Berlin. And there are, well, there was a huge colony of villas from the 19th century. So, well, main mansions of the great bourgeoisie. And in one of those villas, a conference was held um, where the officials, not only of the SS, but of all relevant German ministries and institutions came together to discuss the so-called Endlösung, the final solution to European Jewry, and this conference, but certainly the history around it and the impact the conference had is documented in this really wonderful place at the Wannsee. Then sometimes overlooked, but very important topic in the history of World War II and, well, Nazi rule across Europe is slave labor. In the eastern districts of Berlin, there's a slave labor documentation center on the grounds of a former slave labor camp. You have to imagine more than 25 million people were enslaved by the Nazis as part of the German war machine, just to give an impression of the dimension of what we're talking about here. And right next in that neighborhood, you see one of the, well, most interesting but also overlooked museums in the city of Berlin, the German-Russian Museum, actually the site where the German military commander signed the unconditional surrender to the Soviet commander-in-chief at that time. So there were two ceremonies, one in the western part, and then on May 8th, 45, then one on May 9th, it surrendered to the Soviet Union. And in this original site, which is really stunning, there is another great exhibition about the history of German-Russian relations, but particularly, and this is really important, a really important history to know about the very specific ideological warfare between Nazi Germany and so the Soviet Union, leading to another just incredible scale of mass murder conducted by the Germans. So how, well, these are just a few places. I could go on for hours talking about this. How does Berlin as a city relate to the content of the course? Well, first of all, Berlin was the capital of the Third Reich, so all major institutions, ministries, agencies, etc., had their headquarters in the city of Berlin, and so, well, it's sort of natural that the city is playing an important role here. But also, I mean, Berlin by far was the biggest city in Germany. Well, not only today, but also at that time, around 4 million people lived there, and it was considered to be a red city, a city dominated by social democrats and communists, where the Nazis had actually a tough standing. And we will look at the everyday life as well, particularly with a particular focus on Berliners in those years during National Socialist rule. Then Berlin, as the largest city, is a very attractive city. Well, even then, attractive city, had become a center of Jewish life across Europe before the Holocaust. It started actually in the 19th century, but particularly during the Weimar Republic, it became a hotspot for very different strands of Jewish cultural, social, political movements. And so we will look at a world that had been destroyed by the Nazis as well, and on the way how the Nazis actually destroyed this world. And speaking of destruction, this might be a last um, important Berlin feature in this course because it still is so visible. Um, the destruction of the inner city of Berlin. In the inner city district, approximately 50% of all buildings have been destroyed by Allied bombers. And while, well, you see, you don't see the ruins anymore. You can see what had been built on top of the ruins, particularly after 1989. So this is another Berlin aspect you will be confronted with in this course, but also during your stay in the city of Berlin. Well, as I said, today I will hold, or I will give you a short lecture. We're not doing hours lecturing, but a short lecture on a topic that is important, interesting, and certainly disputed. There was a fly, I'm sorry. It is about the relationship between National Socialism as a political regime and the German people. Because there have been, for years after World War II and after the end of National Socialist rule, there have been the, well, the understanding, particularly in West Germany, that the German people had been sort of the first victims of a small group of political gangsters. So that has to be made a difference between Nazism and Nazi rulers and the German population. And of course, there has to be made a difference between those who are in power, in charge, and those who are being powered. But when we take a closer look, and historical research has done that for now 25 years or so, we take a closer look at the reactions of the average German to National Socialism in very different stages of National Socialist rule. We see a whole variety of different forms of relationship, ranging from support, so active support, passive approval, indifference, but also some sort of resistance. And although we cannot cover all of these topics throughout National Socialism from 1933 to 1945, I hope that I can give you an insight look into the, well, kind of the way how historians try to differentiate first, and then in the second step, make a point and make a decision of how or what sort of behavior dominated in that time, rather than judging before having done the research. I will focus on the first years of National Socialist rule, just for the reason that I want to leave some for the discussion we will have in class the next time when we meet, but also because I just can't speak for hours here and have to make a decision where to focus. So we'll look at 1933-34 in particular. Well, as I said, some facts first. You have to know that before the Nazi, the Nazi Party was founded as a reaction of, well, a small group of people, actually a handful of people, including one former soldier, Adolf Hitler, in the aftermath of World War I as a Bavarian splinter party, and so many others. So there had been dozens, if not actually hundreds, of these small parties, and most of them at a certain point just died out. And the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, that's the official full name, at certain points in its early history was also at the brink of not only dissolution, but of elimination because of a lack of support, a lack of organization, lack of finance, definitely, and also because of internal rivalries. So so the NSDAP grew up in Bavaria and was a Bavarian thing, a very specifically Bavarian thing that came or became public across Germany only in 1923 when Hitler personally participated in a failed putsch against the local government in Bavaria. And you might know that he got imprisoned, he was sentenced and imprisoned for, well, for less than a year, actually. It was imprisoned where he wrote his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, that had become, or later would become, sort of the Bible of Nazi ideology. Also important in this, space where the Nazi Party was almost invisible in the German political system, is that, sort of silently, since the mid-1920s, Hitler's and his close comrades started organizing mass street organizations, in particular the SA, though as a wing, so a wing on this, a wing of the party that would kind of propagate on the streets, that would go violent at political enemies on the street, but was considered to be a part, an extension of the party to the street. And the SA, later became very important in the many street fights, political street fights, at the end of the Weimar Republic and also the beginning of National Socialist rule. So as I said, in elections, sometimes at local elections, the Nazis gained some momentum, but in general elections, they were, if they were represented in the Reichstag at all, they were one of the many very small groups with 2 to 5, maybe 10 members of parliament. But in 1930, in a general election, the so-called landslide elections, the NSDAP turned second strongest party after the Social Democrats, gaining almost 20% of the general vote. And from then on, in every single election, the Nazis rose in numbers of seats in parliament. The last election before the Nazis came to power in 1932 saw them at 37.4% and was by far the strongest party then. So what's interesting to keep in mind if we think about the relation between party, regime, and the people is that yes, since 1930, so already the, well, phase of the beginning of the dissolution of the Weimar Republic, the NSDAP gains momentum, gains representation in public, so has massive support, but the majority, a clear majority of Germans did not vote for the Nazis. So how did they come into power, actually, if they had no majority? As I said, the Weimar Republic at that time was already in dissolution. It was governed by emergency decrees. Parliament, well, did not really have anything to say anymore. And it was a small group of conservative and right-wing politicians that convinced the, well, very old, maybe senile, Reich president at that time to appoint Hitler as German Chancellor, leading a minority government in a coalition with a right-wing conservative party at that time. But they still did not have the majority. This is important to know, because how do we evaluate this process of the Nazis coming into power? In earlier days, historians followed actually the Nazi wording, calling it the seizure of power, Machtergreifung. Seizure of power means that the Nazis, well, implicitly by force, took power from someone, overcoming in a revolutionary way the old system. This is just not true. It didn't need any violence or any revolution. The power was given to the Nazis. So this is why the majority of historians today use different terms. One of them, the one I use, is Machtübernahme, so the takeover of power, which, as I wrote down here, emphasizes the legal character of this process, as well as it happened within the constitution of the Weimar Republic. That's again leaving questions about the quality of the Weimar Constitution, but that's a different lecture, not today. We speak of Machtübernahme, takeover of power, and that already indicates it was not a small group that kind of took power away, but was a group, the Nazis, that were giving power by other forces of German society. Already a first hint of how we can relate the German people to National Socialism. So there were groups within German society, within wider German society, that had an interest in bringing the Nazis to power. But as it was a takeover of power, as they were given power, or as power was transferred to the Nazis through a legal act, it's also quite clear that it was not inevitable. At any point of this process, the last days of the Weimar Republic, any relevant actor could have decided in a different way if he had wanted to. Nobody wanted to, so this is why we also say it was not inevitable, but it was also not an accident. The anti-democratic forces, not all of them had been Nazis, were just too many and too strong at the end of the Weimar Republic. This is one, not the only one, but one important reason why it eventually collapsed. Just as an illustration of what I was saying today, I want to refer to the so-called Day of Potsdam. Look at this image. It shows on the right side the Reichspräsident, so the president of the German Reich, the highest position in the Reich, with well, predominantly ceremonial, but in some respect very important political powers as well, in a military uniform, showing him as General Field Marshal of World War I, also very important, so representing the old regime. His name is Paul von Hindenburg. Many streets in Germany are still named after him, and again, this is hugely disputed. So, as a representative of the old regime, he's encountering the new appointed, not elected, appointed Chancellor Adolf Hitler. And this photo illustrates how Hitler, well, is posing as a subordinate to the old, to the representative of the old elite. So the idea of this Day of Potsdam and this image became very popular, almost iconic, was to show the public that Hitler and the Nazis would actually subordinate themselves to what has been called Old Prussia, or, well, Prussian German traditions, so the old elites. So it's, well, the photo insinuates, well, not, it's more than a compromise, it's a unification between the old and the new, and this actually calmed down many concerns among conservatives, but also liberal middle classes. I mean, the Social Democrats and Communists could not be convinced by such a photo, but this huge block of liberal middle classes and conservatives was deeply affected by this imagery. So I'd like to summarize the first part of this lecture, asking if Germans approve Hitler coming into power. As we saw, the Nazis had strong support after 1930, but at no point they had the majority of votes or seats in the German parliament. Even the semi-free elections of March 1933, when the communists were already banned, social democrats had already been persecuted, and in general, an atmosphere of fear had been created. The NSDAP did not get the majority of votes, so they still had to go into a coalition with the conservatives. Was there any form of opposition? Yes, of course. As I said, communists, social democrats, and to some, very lesser extent, liberals, but also labor unions that have been very powerful in Germany since the 19th century, were some of those forces that strictly opposed the Nazis in 1933, and in particular in the first weeks had posed a major threat to the Nazi plannings of establishing dictatorship. For example, a general strike that had been used as a political weapon throughout the Weimar Republic to turn down right-wing uprisings had been considered by labor unions and social democrats, but was, well, never realized for reasons we can't discuss here. So there was an opposition. So this is why the Nazis, I will come back to that later on, focused in their terror of the early weeks and months of the regime on these groups, communists and social democrats. Most Germans were willing to give it a try, seeing the Weimar Republic as a huge failure. I mean, you know about the economic devastation throughout Germany as part of the global crisis, but in Germany, the Weimar Republic and democratic politicians had been made responsible for the economic slump. So many people thought, we're just longing for some different, for something different, for what was debated then, for a breakthrough, to something very new, and they were willing to support, well, even anti-democratic parties, even if they had been affiliated to democratic parties before. So the Weimar Republic, the German democratic system had been too weak to create strong bondings to its population anymore. This explains why a considerable number of Germans just behaved in sort of indifference. Okay, the others failed. Now let Hitler do it, and not overlooking the consequences that would have. Most importantly, I've mentioned that looking at that photo before, the Nazis were able to go into this alliance with the conservatives and also a sort of informal alliance with the Catholic Center Party to win over the Catholic population. And well, there are many kind of reasons and interests behind this process. In short term, the Nazis always knew that they would be, in the end, they would be stronger than the conservative, aristocratic, monarchical movements. On the other hand, the so-called old elites thought that they could handle, that they could deal with Hitler, they could contain him, and well, as we all know, they failed catastrophically and very early on. They failed. Last but not least, and this is something that has to be considered as well, particularly then for the later history of National Socialism, and particularly in regard to the persecution and the murder of the German Jews and other minorities, is that people just became so indifferent towards ideology and politics in general, as long as they were not affected by it, but kind of, well, they would not approve violent action by the regime, but would see it just as a sort of a collateral damage that had to be Germany had to go through for a better future. I do not kind of judge what sort of behavior and thinking dominated at that time. We do not have kind of polls like we have in the modern political systems. We only have results from elections. We have some individual subjective accounts in diaries, autobiographies, letters, etc. And we can read through kind of the daily press a little bit so by interpreting articles here, how Germans reacted to certain events. But it's very, very difficult to gain clear ground here and to come to a clear-cut decision. Yeah, that brings me to another round of facts. The well, as I mentioned before, the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship happened very, very quickly in short steps, one after another. It was a time of very dramatic and rapid change where people woke up every day and, well, the world had changed in comparison to yesterday. This is important to know the velocity of decrease of political action that was taken, to understand what was going on. As I said, the first focus of the Nazis after they had come to power in 30th January in 1933, the main focus was the crushing, destruction, the persecution of their political enemies, communists, social democrats in particular, and also the exclusion of these forces from the political process. And there were actually two kind of ways of doing that. First was by decrease, as far as possible, but also by using street violence. So arbitrary persecutions, using torture, and threatening politicians, particularly on the local level, that would not make the headlines. So the Nazis came into power end of January 1933. Only 4 weeks later, fundamental constitutional rights had been suspended, and they would never be restored again. And the plenary power had been transferred to the Nazi government. So what had happened? Maybe you've heard of that. That a young Dutch communist. Well, it's a young Dutch communist burned or started a fire in the Reichstag, which burned out, and that made the Nazis to set up emergency decrees suspending the constitutional rights and establishing a dictatorship by eliminating parliamentary control. Another very important step, and these are all kind of very, well, again, day-by-day decisions, and these decisions are all connected with each other. Another very important aspect when when we think about the relation between regime and the people, was the establishment of the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under the diabolic Joseph Goebbels. I will come to that later on. As propaganda became such an important feature of Nazi politics in two ways. In one way, portraying the Nazi Germany as superior to other nations by portraying the successes of Nazi Germany, but on the other hand, also by stigmatizing others who were considered not to be members of the so-called national community, like Jews, like Sinti and Roma people, homosexuals, etc., etc. Another very important process called in German Gleichschaltung, and this is one of those terms you just cannot translate, meaning that all German institutions and organizations successively, not all at once, but successively became Nazified. meaning they were reorganized, re-coordinated along to the ideological and organizational patterns of well, Nazi institutions. I mean, the trade unions, labor unions, are the most important examples. They were destroyed in May 1933 and then reorganized along Nazi ideology. But also, to give you another example, Germany at that time was a federal state, and those Länder, the provinces, or in, well, American English, the states, they were not dissolved, but they lost all sorts of, all of their competences and well, their, well, chances to being involved in political decision-making processes. So this all is subsumed under the term of Gleichschaltung or Nazification. The same part, also part of that process is the introduction of the so-called Führer principle, das Führerprinzip, in those institutions. So that were, well, most of them actually organized, well, like the German state, the German Nazi state, the ideal German Nazi state was with the Führer on top and the kind of the masses on the bottom, and the masses that would just listen and obey to the decrees of the Führer. So all Nazified institutions got also under the so-called Führer principle. And another important aspect in establishing dictatorship, now going back to the terrorist side, the violent side of the regime, was the construction of the first permanent concentration camp in Dachau, close to the city of Munich, in March 1933. There had been so-called wild concentration camps, so former prisons, military installations, breweries, actually, that had been used as kind of places for torture and murder as well, but in a rather unsystematic way. And, as early as March 1933, with the Dachau concentration camps, the concentration camp system that would become such, well, a murderous machinery across Europe was established then. And well, also, well, not directly connected to that, but on the at the same time, the Nazis made clear that their anti-Semitic ideology and rhetorics was meant seriously, and they organized a state boycott and also organized violence against Jewish businesses as early as 1st April 1933, actually with support from a surprisingly high number of the German population. Again, it's not quantifiable, but if we look at images, if we read accounts of that of those days, it is astonishing how many Germans actually became complicit in the early phase of anti-Semitic violence. I already mentioned the destruction of the labor unions. Don't want to go back into that. This period of establishing a dictatorship came to an end in summer 1934 with two events. The first was the so-called Night of Long Knives, or the Rhön Purge. Well, a mass murder action aimed at inner party rivals, but also aimed at the former conservative coalition partners, as some of them had actually engaged in some sort of opposition rings against the regime. And this Night of Long Knives also is important, as it is the turning point in the power relation or in the power standing of the SS within the Nazi state. The SS after that is given many competences and rights and well starts creating itself as a state in the state. And the second event, well, I mean, Germany already was a dictatorship, a Nazi dictatorship, but still formally the old president dies and Hitler becomes officially Führer und Reichskanzler. So Führer and Chancellor of the Reich. So there was no other kind of legitimate power anymore that could somehow contain, control him if that had ever happened before. And in the following, and here I have to end not the lecture, but kind of in chronology, with the establishment of the dictatorship, Nazi Germany is starting to successively creating the envisioned community of the people by, well, excluding and persecuting so-called un-German elements. And there is a very, very long list of who actually was considered to be the non-Aryan German. I mentioned some of them here in the PowerPoint presentation, but besides Jews, Sinti and Roma, homosexual, the disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, there were many, many other groups that were not considered to be part of the German community of the people and part of Germany anymore. And these were the groups that were persecuted and eventually murdered after the outbreak of World War II. So what were the elements of Nazi dictatorship? First, as I mentioned, terror. On this photo, you can see one of the early arrests that had been made. These look like middle class, maybe even bourgeois, or well, at least settled gentlemen. They were political opponents who got imprisoned and are well guarded by an SA soldier. So in the early phase, terror, street terror, open street terror, violence, bloody violence, was a very, very important factor for, well, different reasons. First of all, the Nazis wanted to create an atmosphere of harassment and fear. The German people should know what could happen to them in case they would dare to oppose the system. So deterrence through selective public persecution, torture, and murder was the goal. And interestingly, they did talk about it. So the media, public media, was actually reporting those murders. So everyone knew. If someone in Germany says, I had not heard about these early murders, this is simply not true. They were written down or reported about in every newspaper. And certainly the other aspect is not only the elimination of the political opposition, but also the delegitimization of political opposition and keeping people away just to, well, even to think about joining any form of dissent, opposition, or resistance. As I mentioned, propaganda became an increasingly factor. In 1933, Goebbels' ministry is being founded, the Ministry for Propaganda, and even already in Mein Kampf, Hitler pointed out the importance of modern political propaganda. You can read the text by yourself. So this ministry of Goebbels, first of all, took control of all cultural and media institutions and, well, introduced a modern and a very strict modern version of censorship. So there were briefings. There were to reporters what they were allowed or what they actually were forced to report about. there were purchase um, of newspapers, publishers, etc., particularly Jews, but also kind of social democrats, had to leave office. So there was, again, this repressive side of propaganda in action. But then there was also this seductive side of propaganda. And most importantly, the Nazis, well, systematically uh, well, built up um, radio broadcasts and eventually engaged in filmmaking as an important propaganda tool. And actually, film is another aspect of what we will talk about in this course, but not in this lecture. I just wanted to mention that the Nazis, well, they explored very modern at that time, very modern media for their own propagandist effort. Well, this is another, well, it's a bad photo, couldn't get a better one. This is another aspect of propaganda, one of those mass gatherings you might have seen about, you might have seen. This is already, this is from the so-called Reichsparteitag, so the party rally of the NSDAP, I think from 1935. You see these, well, kind of paramilitary or even military formations, the lights play in the back. So these were highly staged mass events, and there were not only one or two, but many, many, all over the country, all over the year. So this is just one example, and the most famous example, actually, because it was also became part of a very famous film by René Riefenstahl. But there's also, I mean, it's title of the, it's part of the title of the course. There was also a seductive side of National Socialism. Once you had been accepted as a member of the community of people, National Socialism could actually offer something to many people. First of all, well, that's kind of cheap success. They exploited the economic and political successes excessively. So the economic upswing, the political successes in negotiations with foreign countries in particular, the remilitarization of the country was a highly, was a great political success that offered, but also a great propaganda success that seduced many Germans who positively affected by remilitarization. But it also included specific programs that would, well, kind of support or enable Germans or members of the community of people, well, to make use of their pastime in a meaningful way. Some historians consider this agency, the agency where this poster is coming from, Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, as an early form of mass tourism. So for the first time, Germans, or for, not for the first time, but for the first time since a while, Germans were able to travel again, made possible by this Nazi agency. And of course, the aim was, well, to seduce people to, well, create emotional bonds between the people who were had the chance to participate in those programs and the regime. Actually, a very highly successful program because it was, well, it was not unpolitical. Nothing in National Socialist Germany was unpolitical, but they were able to hide away the political aspects of such programs. And then, yes, the question is, well, the important question has to be raised: to what extent was Nazism as a dictatorship approved and supported by Germans? Well, first of all, there was a sufficient base of supporters of National Socialists. We can't count them. Not every voter was of the National Socialists in 33 was a National Socialist, but there are estimates that about 1/3 of the German population could be considered to be hardcore supporters of Nazism. But more important, because that was still a minority, more important was the fact that most Germans could somehow relate to some aspects of National Socialism. So some would support their revisionist program in foreign policy, particularly conservatives, middle classes, or even some social democrats. Some would support their social politics among trade unionists, for example, we find, or even social democrats. Some would support the anti-Semitic um, ideology, particularly from the right-wing Völkisch movement. Nazism had to offer many things, also contradicted each other, many things to many people. And somehow everyone, not everyone, but many, the majority of Germans could relate somehow positively to National Socialism. Then one has to keep in mind, as I mentioned, at the beginning, there was a very kind of rapid series of events, and National Socialism in power had early successes, particularly in foreign policy, and so also in the economy, and that convinced many skeptics, and that kept others who might otherwise have opposed the regime calm for a while. We should not forget how attractive the idea of national unity in a dramatically disunited country was at that time, 1933. So this is another factor that might count. And then if things went wrong, obviously the wrong way, particularly then later on during World War II, when the first news of losses, the dramatic losses, came over to Germany. Germans had a strong tendency to differentiate between the regime and Hitler. So Hitler was seen as the good Führer, whereas his paladins, the system was criticized, and while proverbial saying at that time was, if Hitler only knew, wenn das der Führer wüsste. And last but not least, but this is more a factor that comes into account at the end of National Socialist rule, the German population, to a large extent, had become increasingly complicit in crimes and murders. And there was just no way out anymore, or no convincing way out anymore to salute the bondings to the regime. And this might help us to understand why the support of Nazism, even in 1945, when the end was, well, not near, when it was inevitable, was still so strong, and Germans were still willing to fight for the Nazi regime. Yes, this was my short first introduction into one of the topics of our seminar. Again, I think it's important to look at the not only at the structure of a regime, the political system, the decision makers, but also certainly at well, everyday life, everyday people, different sections of society, and how they related to the to the regime. Not all Germans were blind followers of Nazism, by no means. The more it is important to understand why they did not join an opposition or resistance movement, or well, why it was so few and so late. And so this is one of the another one of the wider questions I would like to discuss with you when I see you in person. If you want to contact me, you see my email address here. I will be most happy to respond to you, actually to any question you have, if it's related to what I was talking here about. But also look at the very different FUBiS social media services and go to their website. I would be very happy to meet you in Berlin one day, and well, do one of those fantastic excursions, have some great classroom experience together. I wish you all the best. Stay healthy. Bye bye.